Thanksgiving meal.
Yeah.
You go in and everybody seems to be talking from one political viewpoint, and you have a different political viewpoint. Do you speak up at that point and start arguing, or do you just say, it's not worth it to me?
Yeah.
It's Thanksgiving. This infuriates me. I think these people are wrong, but I am going to just keep that to myself. That's one level of it. Your question, though, goes into this other element, is where's their harm for this? And there's real harm in it. So we go back to the real foundation, again, of the First Amendment, and even before that, which is John Milton's theory that we want a free flow of ideas. And so, as Milton said, let truth and falsehood grapple, and whoever knew truth did not come out basically the winner. We want this free flow of information. We don't want to limit people, because what was wrong 80 years ago might be right today.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today we're going to be talking about the spiral of silence, and my guest is Mr. Benjy Hamm. We'll be discussing how the spiral of silence theory comes into play in our everyday interactions, and especially on social media. Mr. Hamm is an assistant professor of mass communications at Campbellsville University. He teaches reporting, social media, and a variety of other classes. He's been a guest before, and I'm looking forward to hearing his insight into this subject. Thank you for joining.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the spiral of silence, I'd like to just sort of get your take on the Musk takeover, if you will, or buyout rather. Well, depending on which side you're on, I guess, of Twitter, which the last time we talked, I think there was rumors, but the very first rumors that he was thinking about buying out Twitter, taking over. How do you see that in terms of free speech? I mean, he's an absolutist. What do you think is going to become of that?
Well, I think there's several things that are interesting about the purchase. One is that most people don't realize this, but Twitter as a business hasn't been extraordinarily successful. It's been successful in getting an audience, but most people overestimate the use of Twitter, and they do so because a small number of people use Twitter a whole lot, and it's an echo chamber. So if you look at the percentage of adult Americans who actually are on Twitter and use it regularly, it's less than a quarter. So more than 75% of Americans are not using Twitter. But Twitter has this outsized influence because it tends to be used by journalists, media folks, celebrities, politicians, and those people feed upon themselves. So they have this extraordinary view of how important Twitter is to the world at large. And there are a lot of the rest of us who look at it and say, it's just one more piece in the environment. A number of them are concerned about Musk buying it, which is interesting because most of these are owned primarily by one person, even if there's support. So Zuckerberg with Facebook and other places, concerns right now about TikTok and their attempts to limit TikTok, in the United States. More than once, President Trump tried to and looked at whether to limit TikTok. It's a private business. And one of the issues we have with social media today, or something like Twitter, is there are not 12 of them that people are using for that same sort of thing. Twitter has its own defined area. But Musk has two issues. One is that Twitter's not making money. So the last quarter, they lost a substantial amount of money. They're facing a lot of ad revenue issues. They're not growing with users the way it was. So he's first got to fix the business proposition of Twitter, which is him talking about charging for the verified things with that. So part of his issue is going to be, how do you fix the business side of it? And then how do you deal with this free speech issue? And it's a monster for a place like Facebook or Twitter or others, because on the one hand, it's both an open environment where people are invited and encouraged to post regularly. It is all user-generated content, or almost exclusively user-generated content. So the user is both the person creating the content and the audience for the content. And that's different than a lot of other media that's moderated. So if we were to have a newspaper or a radio station or a TV station or something, the audience can help create content, but there's a moderator for it. In the case of Twitter, they do moderate some, but it's the amount of content that flows through there is really hard.
Well, some reports would say they moderated quite a bit.
Well, yeah, but if you look at actual number of posts that go up every day and how much they impact it, it's extraordinary. So they deal with a very small percentage, and how they deal with it is usually to ban you from using it or to stop you from a period of time or delete your accounts. I mean, they're deleting tens of thousands of accounts every year that are popping up, a lot of the bot accounts and all this misinformation, disinformation accounts. So you've got all of this going on, but most people aren't affected by that. What happens then is when Donald Trump is banned from Twitter, then it gets a lot of attention. But
in the surrounding peripheral to Twitter.
Right.
So it acts, if I understand what you're saying, it's Twitter's the news in other news. Well, sort of like, what happens on Twitter just becomes then something that somebody else can say, oh, well, this happened in Twitter, but not everybody's really that interested in being a consumer of Twitter.
Right, and again, 75% of the Americans aren't. Yeah. So what we're looking at is, of the people who are there, they are very fundamentally, grounded in the concepts and free speech and other things. The possible changes that would occur. Right. And there are a number of people who are concerned about will it be this free flow again that where you have extraordinary hate speech and other stuff. This occurs every day, but at least Twitter is trying to limit it now. If they do cut the staff significantly, if they do make some of the changes they're looking at, it could easily become a much more Wild West environment that has less moderation. And on the one hand, we are a society that encourages a free flow of information, but we've always felt more comfortable when there is some moderation of that.
Yeah. So in terms of business model, do you think that the idea of free flow and maybe it getting a little bit out of control, do you think that helps Musk? And I mean, they call him a free speech absolutist. I'm not sure that that's entirely true, but as you're saying, he's got, if he wants it to be profitable, and maybe he doesn't, but there has to be some change in business model, something to bring. I mean, revenue's one thing. I mean, trying to get people to pay for a verification, but do you think that that free for all is going to be enticing to some people who see this as a like, oh yeah, well let's go now, let's jump in and make waves?
I think it has the potential to be more enticing to some people. So if you allow more of that robust and free flow feistiness that might occur, some would say that leads to hate speech and other things. It does. I mean, it definitely does. But it might increase interaction and engagement, which is typically where social media gets its dollars, is engagement and all. The issue you have in this case is, do companies that are established companies with reputations, do they back off of something if it starts to become a less desirable area? They may not want to be associated with that type of content. And so there's already been some rumblings that if it starts going in a certain direction, some of these companies may pull back. Well, they're not getting dollars off of users. They're getting dollars off of advertisers. And so to get more dollars or get more revenue from advertisers, they build up engagement, they build up users and other things. They may increase engagement, and it might increase, in some cases, users and people developing content. But if at the same time you have advertisers pull back and say, we don't want to be part of this, it's too nasty, it's too ugly, it's whatever, we don't want to be associated with that, then I think that's Elon Musk has just bought something that is extraordinarily complicated.
Yeah.
And if it were easy to figure out, other people would have already figured out how to deal with it. He may have ideas on how to solve it, but there's no perfect idea that says, okay, we're going to just embrace freedom of speech, and then that's the missing piece that's held Twitter back all along. That's not the case. There's, you know, when you move this lever this way, then something else happens in the other direction, and you've got to decide, is that trade-off worth it?
Yeah, a lot of variables going on.
Right.
Definitely. And I had heard, and I don't want to call the name of the company, but that at least one company's already pulled out. I don't, you know, that's just a report that I briefly heard. One of the things that as you were talking about free speech and the interactions, for most of our existence, we haven't had a lot of free speech. And when I say we, humans, you know, for most of our existence, there hasn't been a lot of free speech. And then, you know, some of the printing press and some of the other things, technologies came on. And I was reading an article earlier about how, you know, in the 90s with the advent of the internet, you still had the major players, you know, the big broadcast companies, newspapers, magazines, who were transitioning over to the internet. And so it was just a different broadcast mechanism. But then late 90s, early 2000s, the advent of what's now known as Web 2.0, where people could interact with one another, user-generated content, as you mentioned, brought a whole new level of, from like freedom of speech and interaction, brought a new level of anticipation of what that might hold. And then all of a sudden we hit, you know, mid 2010s, and there's misinformation. So how does all of that play from I mean, how do we know as just general media consumers, how do we navigate all of this?
Well, it fits in with what historically has been the case. We have this phrase that's developed that's from awe to entertainment, that any new technology, we're in awe of it. We look at the possibilities. It's going to help freedom of speech. It's going to help educate our children. It's going to be all these things. And what happens then is we ultimately then start to use those media outlets for channels for entertainment. So we looked at radio and television, the internet, and social media. So each one of those along the way, we look at it and we see these enormous possibilities. We see these extraordinary educational opportunities. And then what happens is it starts to bog down a little bit in entertainment and issues with nastiness and insults and all sorts of things that we're not comfortable with. It's both. So social media is both extraordinary from its advancement, and it's allowed open participation from people. It has greatly increased people's ability to access information, to share information with others, to go beyond the traditional outlets that were limiting what they were able to do and share. Again, historically, if you had thoughts on something that occurred on television, you had no ability to share that. You couldn't yell at the television, and it was only going to be heard by your own family members.
Well, you could, right?
Yeah, but it got no.
He's crazy.
It didn't get to the person who was doing the news on television or doing the show. Now you have this outlet that allows you to not only share with other people, but share back with those folks as well. So you can actually, you know, if they will participate in that back and forth, you can message and have direct conversations with people in a way that was never possible before. So it's very good in so many ways. And then it brings about this other aspect of that, again, there is no perfect medium that allows us to then, that it's all for good. You know, anything that is created can be both good and bad, and we've seen that with social media. Some people think it's worse than, you know, that it's worse than it is good, and some people think it's better than it is worse. But it's both, and it will be both. But it's impossible for it not to have both negative and positive issues.
We're really talking about 20 years of, and really less than that when you think about how extensive it's become in terms of the population. And as you were speaking, the thought occurred to me that it's almost like we're still immature when it comes to being able to leverage the technology and, okay, maybe not leverage it, but how we communicate, how we interact, and the idea that we can, we've never had a voice as individuals to the whole world.
Right.
And so, you know, maybe we're just immature. Maybe we just don't know how to communicate yet very well.
It's a very good point. And I think the research that I remember is that in the year 2000, half of United States adults had access to the internet either at home or at work. Many of those at work. Right. So that means less than half of the people had access to the internet at home. And we're not even talking about social media yet. Yeah. We go back to 2008, 2009, the dominant social media platform was MySpace. And so we're in this period now where Twitter is, you know, important, and Facebook is extraordinarily important, and YouTube has, you know, it's both a social media channel and it's an entertainment channel as well. But all of these have had enormous impact, but you're right, it's been in a short period of time. So we don't have research over 30 or 40 years as we do, or 50 or 60 with television, to say, what's the impact of this? Mm-hmm. What's the impact of the influence of radio? With social media, we're still so new to this. And even the internet, with a lot of people, we don't have a lot of research into it. We haven't had a lot of information that shows us where we're going with it, and what both the harm and the gain has been.
Being so embedded in it, or it being embedded with us now, it's hard to think back 10 years ago, and yeah, there were some really good phones, the BlackBerry, things like that, maybe 12 years ago, right? But the fact that we have a supercomputer in our hands, or on our person, or near our person, almost 24/7. And I know that their access is still limited, in some cases, but most of Americans, and most of the world, in fact, have access to some phone technology, some smartphone technology. That's an incredibly short period of time to go from. I mean, one of the things I show in my advertising class is the 1984 commercial with Mac, mm-hmm. with the Macintosh coming out as this personal computer. Man, we wouldn't put up with that sort of computer now. Back then it was right. A thing, right? It was huge. It was like, okay, we're breaking free. But man, that's not that long ago.
Right. So if you think about it, people who are 45 and older did not grow up in a household that had a computer at home of any form. So not only did we not have phones, so people of my age and your age can remember when we had a home computer, just as my father can remember when they first had their own television. Mm-hmm. It never occurred to me we wouldn't have a television in the home. And so it never occurred to my children that we didn't have a computer. If not, each of us have our own, and then that each of us have our own phone, and that they're not only phones, but they're smartphones, and we have this ability then to do a lot of different things. But it's still extraordinarily recent in the time frame for both media and society. It's a very, very small window of time.
Yeah. It is, and I was, you're speaking about, the telephone, or television, and and so our interactional experience is pretty limited too. I mean, just how we interact. So, like a lot of folks, of the family, the community, in a lot of regards, churches or other organizations, there was a certain structure to communication. And of course, I'm not the, you're the expert in communications, but it just seems to me like we had all this structure to how we communicated, even within the family, within the school, with all these things. There was a sort of a known structure of how you communicated, and then all of a sudden it was a free-for-all.
Well, and I even find it's interesting that as I go into my classrooms, and you probably have the same experience, that if I have a classroom of 25 or 30 people and I walk into class a little bit before class starts, 90 if not 100% of them are all looking individually at their phone. So we have this group environment, we have this in-person gathering, and everybody is individually looking at their own device. And that's, that's different, because when I went into a college classroom, there was this awkward period where you sit down beside somebody and if you try to find something to say to them. There's no real need to that anymore. Or you go into the doctor's office and there's 12 people there and 11 of them are looking at their phones. And that's just the way it is. It's not going to change. That's just how society works today. And so we both are extraordinarily connected, and at the same time we've created this individual world that even when we're together in groups, we're often individually communicating with our own devices.
Outside of the proximal group that we're in.
Right, right.
Yeah. Well, I want to, I'm sure we could continue talking on that subject, but I really want to find out, you mentioned when we were in discussion about the idea of the spiral of silence. And you were talking about the classroom and how when you walk into the classroom, there's, folks just are connected to their device and there's not a lot of interaction going on between the group that's in there. And I want to, it reminded me of an article that I have read recently, which was talking about the reluctance of individuals, it was about higher education students, and the reluctance of students to voice an opinion, to put themselves out there, even if they have an opinion or maybe they don't have an opinion. The article the author was unsure if it's just that individuals don't want to voice an opinion because of how they may, look to the rest of the group, or if they have an opinion at all. And I know that's a little bit off of the spiral of silence, but with that in mind, what is the spiral of silence?
Well, and I think it incorporates the other piece of it too, is that I do think people have a lot of opinions. They just might keep them to themselves. And so I was reminded of this, that I remember an Olympic race one time where the finish was such where one person slid across the finish line feet first. And another runner won the race because the measure was, of course, here. And there were all these people who were suddenly experts on Olympic rules, and that the person who got your toe across first should have been the winner. These people had never run a race in their life.
Yeah.
It was clear. They had never competed at that. They didn't know the rules, but they had very strong opinions about what was being done wrong at the Olympic level. And I was just struck by the fact that as people who were uninformed, who were had no experience in that subject, but they were extraordinarily opinionated about it. Yeah. And I think so. We have this mix going on today, which is that people feel like, because they're exposed to different things, that they are that they have some very strong opinions about things that they maybe wouldn't have had before. Mm-hmm. And we talk about the fact that today we know things through media and social media that we didn't know before. We have access to events going on across the world. And along with that, people have very strong opinions about whether it's right or wrong, even if they have no concept of what history says or and whatever. So I think both are occurring. I think people have very strong opinions. A lot of them can be good opinions. Some of them can be sound opinions, but a lot of them are just opinions. Mm-hmm. They're no different than if you were to ask me about, a nuclear device. I don't know anything about it, but I might have an opinion on it. But what difference does my opinion mean? With social media, people feel compelled then to share opinions, whether they have any standing or expertise at all. So the person who has, the joke on, on social media is that the person who's, telling you about infectious diseases didn't even, failed science in 10th grade, but they think they're an expert on infectious diseases and how they spread and everything else. That's occurring on one level. And on the other level is that we have
So just this desire to put my opinion out there, even though it's just opinion, I just feel like I need to state it. So that's one hand.
Yeah, and feeling like that it's relevant in some way. I mean, I might have in the past thought, what do I know about infectious diseases? And who am I to comment on it? That doesn't seem to inhibit people today. They seem to think that I don't know anything about this topic, but here's my opinion that I want to share publicly to everybody. You have that going on. And then on the other hand, what you have is what we're looking at is that because of this sharing and because of how things are done, we have a certain number of people who are just backing up and saying, I don't want to be part of this. I'm not going to share my opinion. And the spiral of silence is that people will, over time, if they feel like they're in the minority, if they feel like they are not, part of the larger thought process, if they're not in sync with that instead of arguing about it, they will decide just to withhold their opinions. And that over time, if the opposition side withholds opinion, there might be 6 people in that group of 30 who think the same way. But each of them will decide on their own, the majority, everybody else must think this, I must be the outlier, I'm just going to keep it to myself. Various reasons for that. But what happens then is that each of them then, the spiral is that they become more and more silent, and they begin to think that this group, because the people who feel compelled to speak up and feel comfortable about speaking up seem to be an even greater majority. So they dominate the conversation more, their opinion is more and more, and this other group then continues to sort of withdraw.
So it reinforces that minority of feeling, even if that wasn't the case in the beginning, in terms of actually being a minority.
Right, yeah. It may have been that it was 15-15 on the views, but the 15 started being very loud about their opinions, and then the other 15 thought, well, I'm the only one who must believe that. I'm going to keep it to myself. And then all of a sudden you think the whole group is in support of something. We see this in other cases. We see it in groupthink. We see it in other things that occur where if you feel like you have an alternative view that is that other people might be hostile to, or you're going to look differently. So some of the elements of that is that you feel like that if you speak up, you'll become more isolated, or it will create conflict. Yeah. And we tend to be people who don't really want to invite conflict, so why would I speak up? Mm-hmm. Spiral of silence really works on 2 pieces. One is that what are my chances of success? So I'm weighing that versus what are the cost of this? So if the cost is I speak up, it creates conflict, I might be sort of isolated from the group or not be part of the group. There's different, an outcast type of thing. Those are all the cost. And then my view of success is I could speak up, but they're not willing, they're not really interested in my opinion. I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to keep it to myself. If I thought that this was occurring here, but if I spoke up, maybe that could change, then I'm more likely to do it. So our speaking up is often balanced with these two pieces of, is there a chance of success and what are the costs involved? And we're constantly weighing that. And if we look at it and say there's a lot of cost involved and not much room for success, we're more likely to go silent.
I guess end result of that for an individual of taking this path of silence, this, falling into the spiral of silence, well, number one, for the individual, where does that land you? And then number two, for society. I know that's a two-part sort of idea, but from the individual standpoint, you self-censor. You've used that a couple of times, that word in other discussions we've had. Where does this self-censoring end?
Yeah, so it's a very powerful thing of self-censoring. And in that you're doing it, but you also feel like if you were to speak out, the group would sort of censor you. So you're self-censoring because you think you would be punished if you were to speak out. Punished in quotes. It could be in various forms. That you're not literally punished, but it created conflict. Thanksgiving meal.
Yeah.
You go in and everybody seems to be talking from one political viewpoint, and you have a different political viewpoint. Do you speak up at that point and start arguing, or do you just say, it's not worth it to me?
Yeah.
It's Thanksgiving. This infuriates me. I think these people are wrong, but I am going to just keep that to myself. That's one level of it. Your question, though, goes into this other element, is where's their harm for this? And there's real harm in it. So we go back to the real foundation, again, of the First Amendment, and even before that, which is John Milton's theory that we want a free flow of ideas. And so, as Milton said, let truth and falsehood grapple, and whoever knew truth did not come out basically the winner. We want this free flow of information. We don't want to limit people, because what was wrong 80 years ago might be right today. In fact, there's 1,000 examples we could use where majority opinion at one point was that something should have happened. So if we go back 120 years ago, women did not have the right to vote.
All right.
We look at that today and think, well, that's ludicrous. Yeah. Who thought that was a good idea? But just as we go back and say, well, wait a minute, the earth wasn't flat. Who thought that? Yeah. You know, who thought a lot of these things, medical procedures and other things that we did, dumping pollutants in the water, and that was going to wash them away, and instead, you know, I mean, you go back to Benjamin Rush and the theory of, you know, as he was looking at it from a medical standpoint in early colonial America, with this idea of, you know, he understood that these, you know, this standing water and all was a problem. He didn't necessarily know that it was mosquitoes, but he kept arguing that there was a problem with this, and people thought he was nuts. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out he was right. Yeah. And so what we think was wrong over time can become right. And what we thought was right can become wrong. And so that's where Milton's thing is. Let's keep having this debate. If we silence ourselves, then it limits the discussion that's out there. Yeah. And it might just be the Thanksgiving dinner. And maybe Thanksgiving dinner is one we just want to let go and we're not going to argue about. But from a societal standpoint, it can be really important, because we're not, if we start censoring ourselves, and it's occurred, you know, all through history, then we start not allowing this exchange of ideas that starts to change policies. It starts to change our elected leaders. And within companies, again, groupthink is a perfect example of sort of a silence that occurs where a few people in the group come to a decision or start pushing a decision. Yeah. A lot of people just withdraw. They don't speak out. And then you come to a faulty decision that's based on what we call groupthink, when in fact not everybody in the group probably agreed with it, but there's a real cost to that. I mean, the Space Shuttle Challenger was is considered to be an example of where groupthink went wrong, and the O-rings were not.
What's the story there?
Yeah, so it's one of these examples that's used is that the company that did the O-rings kept saying, there were a few people who said, well, these have not been tested below a certain degree, and so it's cold in Florida, and they decide, that they start having these discussions. We don't think you should launch NASA, and NASA's pushing back and saying, well, wait a minute, you've never said this to us. It's the last minute. We've got to launch these, and they have these discussions, and then they come back to the company says, give us some time, and they go back and they have their own discussions, and the leader of that division says, basically, I agree with NASA. Let's, why are we doing this? Yeah. They come back and they say, does anybody disagree with the decision to launch? And everybody's silent. Even those who oppose it don't want to speak up, because what is the risk to them? The risk is possibly their job, their company, conflict with NASA within their own group. And so that's the groupthink part that leads to people.
So in that case, everybody's guilty.
Right.
I mean, and guilt is a bad choice of words, but you didn't speak up even though you knew there was a real risk. And understanding that part of the risk is if nothing happens, you just put a bad face on your company and but at the same time, something bad did happen, and it sounded like they sort of knew that it might.
Right, and as they said before, we've had 30 or however many launches. We've never had a problem. Yeah. So these decisions always look, clearer after the fact. So it's easier to go back now and to have that as a textbook example of groupthink, and there are people who use that, videos with that and look at that as groupthink, but at the time, when you're speaking out, there's never been a problem. Yeah. And you just think there could be. Well, and then you have people who are, so people did speak out initially, but then when it came back to it again, they said, does anybody have a problem? And everybody went silent. Yeah. Does anybody disagree? Yeah. It happens all the time.
We've all been in business meetings that don't have to do with shooting a rocket into space. That we've seen that happen for sure.
I've told people before. I've been in a corporate meeting before where something is presented, and I think, well, this idea has some problems, and we would be in the discussion, and within a couple of minutes, the president would say, well, I'm for it. Let's proceed. Oh, does anybody have any concerns? Yeah. Or does anybody oppose it?
Right.
Well, at that point, you have to then now oppose the president, and you go back through this thing again. What's the cost to me? Right. And
and it's going to happen anyway, no matter what.
The president said we're going to do it, and so that shut off any discussion.
Yeah.
We practice self-censorship and say, well, it's not worth it to me to get involved in this case. Let it go. It happens every day.
And taking that to a societal level, when I looked up the spiral of silence, just at least have some understanding of what was going on. The only one of the only researches that I found was done by Pew Research, and it was about Edward Snowden. Are you familiar with that one?
Sure.
Yeah, and so around the dinner table, people were likely to talk about the impact of this sort of new era of surveillance, that Snowden, and we're talking about 2010, 11, 12, I think 12, versus talking about it outside of the dinner table. And so, it's like talking politics around Thanksgiving turkey. Well, people are, let's have a little fun. It's boring. Let's talk. But
and the same thing with COVID. So we saw during COVID a whole lot of both people offering opinions about things, but then a certain group of people that would just go silent. So whether you were pro-vaccination or you were anti-vaccination or however you approached it, if you were in a group that had a different viewpoint, you likely did not speak up.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we don't have people, and so some people will hear this and say, well, no, there are people every day offering opinions. Yeah. If we go back and look at it, it's a lot of times the same people who are offering opinions. It's people who feel comfortable to offer opinions, or people who get some sort of satisfaction of offering opinions. But there's still a whole other group of people who just stay silent, yeah, or they don't feel good about that unless they're being encouraged or unless they feel like they're within the group that supports their viewpoints.
Yeah. The other aspect that I had thought about too was the idea of the echo chamber. And so maybe you don't speak up in that bigger group, but you find a group that does support, and then maybe in some ways, and I don't know how you feel about this idea, but you start removing yourself from that group to the degree that, okay, it's not worth it from a social standpoint because I just feel isolated. But over here, I feel more comfortable. Even though this larger group needs to hear more voices. Mm-hmm. So that echo chamber effect, how do you think that impacts this spiral of silence and the censorship, self-censorship?
Well, I think they go hand in hand, because if you're feeling isolated from the larger group, then our nature is that we're not necessarily loners. We're not people who just want to go around by ourselves through life. And so we tend to try to go toward people that have similar beliefs and similar values. And so we start to spend more time with that. And in this case, we're talking about more time online. We're talking about more time on social media. And it may or may not be in a personal setting. We may not be going to a meeting at the community center to have these discussions. We're sitting in our house and we're having those discussions with people digitally. We're doing it through a phone, or we're doing it through our computer. I think it's a real issue, and so it.
How does social? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, so I think what happens is that we then begin to segregate ourselves based on opinions and beliefs, and again, I read a number of anecdotal pieces, and I don't know what the research will ultimately show, but of people who say, well, if these people take this stand for, regarding COVID and the vaccine, I don't want to be around those people, right, including my family. Or we saw it during, the President Trump years of people who would say, I'm with this or I'm not, and take a very strong stand of, I'm not going home for Thanksgiving because I'm not having these conversations. I'm not getting
So not
into
just
this.
self-censoring ourselves, but self-selecting isolation from the larger community that we were part of,
or a regrouping.
Regrouping.
So we can be isolating. We can self-outcast. We can choose not to be part of these groups because being part of that group makes us uncomfortable. So we may be part of them at some point, and then we may decide to spend less time with them or no time at all because their values and views aren't matching where we are.
Yeah. And the role of social media in that, I mean, you've touched on it quite a bit, but in the spiral of silence, is there something about social media that exacerbates that?
I think so, only because that's where we're choosing then to communicate in a lot of cases. And again, if we look at the numbers, one of the issues, again, to go back to Twitter, one of the issues Twitter has is that a large percentage of their content is being driven by a small percentage of users. So a number of people are actually only listeners. They're only watchers. They're not participating in this environment, even though they're choosing to go there. They've chosen to not be participants. Now, maybe that's their nature. Maybe they like the role of listening and watching and letting other people, go back and forth with it. But it also can be part of the thing that if you are putting yourself out there you have the potential that people from all over are going to shame you, challenge you, criticize you.
Not just your cousin that you could care, like, oh, whatever.
Right.
People you don't even know.
And
that's the cancel culture too, the fear of being canceled or, ostracized.
every day people are deleting their accounts because they posted something and they got a negative reaction to it, a very strong negative reaction. And maybe they should have gotten a very strong negative reaction. But they're choosing to then stop that communication, or they go silent for periods of times. Every single day we're reading about this celebrity or that celebrity who posted this or said that. And again, people from, some celebrity posts something, Taylor Swift, and then somebody from Detroit is commenting on it, and somebody from somewhere else is commenting on it, and somebody else. These people are not people who are even part of their lives, and then it's interesting because I was listening to a singer-songwriter talking about that she was asked to post one time on social media that she was appearing on Saturday Night Live, and she wasn't much for social media at the time, but decided to go ahead and do it. And she said that she was all excited. This was her first chance to be on Saturday Night Live as a great national audience. She's looked at this as an opportunity for years. And she posted and through her personal account, and she said all of the responses suddenly were, well, if you're going to go on TV, you need to have your nose fixed. Oh. Are you sure you're going to look like that? What clothes are you going to wear? And she said all of a sudden she's bombarded with this negativity to where it changed her whole mood about going on this show. And she said
that's bullying, right?
Her husband said, cut it off, stop. And she said she couldn't stop. But these were anonymous people from wherever. These weren't in her friend circle. And all of a sudden it changed her behavior in that it made her feel very differently about this opportunity.
She went from being really confident about being invited to being really self-aware or
self-doubt.
Self-doubt.
This extraordinarily insecurity, and start to think, and then all of a sudden that could have an effect on performance. And well, that's all influenced by people we don't know. Yeah. We don't even know where they're from. And all of a sudden, people again think they have some need to tell you that you don't look right for this or whatever. So it's occurring every single day. I mean, and again, social media has an enormous possibility, that we can do a lot of great things with it. And we open up this free expression and free speech, and yet what it leads to in a number of cases is sort of a destructive environment.
Yeah, and I know that the social media has its different, it's not just the different platforms have different audiences and all of this. It's also too that social media seems to be, it's not for everybody, even though a lot of people are on. It's like you're talking about Twitter, and so the people who are on there, as you say, the minority of people get the loudest voice because they're willing to put their thoughts out there and all of that. And so it makes me wonder about social discourse. It makes me wonder with the idea that, as I was finding out a little bit about it, the thing, I don't want to overuse the what happened in Germany and in the 30s, but that's sort of what happened. That people just became quiet because of real threats, Mm-hmm. But where does this leave us for social discourse and the idea of democracy? Because I see free speech as fundamental to democracy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that with each new technological advancement, we're both we're not sure where it's going to take us. And so there was a lot of concern, of course, with television that it was going to influence people's lives and change them in ways. It has. Television has very definitely changed society, and society has changed television. What we don't know now is if we were to remove television, how that would change our society. But we were able to, in my morning class, we were looking at the Kennedy-Nixon debate. We were able to see presidential candidates for the first time and actually watch them and hear them and in hopes make better decisions as a result. So again, I don't want to be the one who says social media is all bad. It's certainly not. There's extraordinary good that's come from social media, but we don't know enough yet. I mean, there are a lot of harms, and we don't know enough yet on where this is going to take society in 5 or 10 or 20 years, how it's going to change and how it's going to change the discourse and whether it actually does what we hope in the awe phase of we hope this actually helps open up greater discussion. It takes the ability to communicate out of the hands of a small group of people with media channels and all, and it gives more to individuals and gives them an opportunity to speak out and speak up. That's the ideal. That's what we hope is where we're headed, and we're continuing to head. But we don't know yet.
The thing that I'm wondering as you've been talking is, can this spiral effect actually, well, number one, can it alter it does alter our behavior because we become more silent, but from what we believe, or even from a cognitive standpoint of, is there a possibility that, because if you and I go along, then this other person, without hearing our voices, will just, okay, well, that's how everybody believes. And so it sort of just becomes, it's not just a spiral, it's the sort of sucking in of everybody into that particular idea or that way of thinking. And so is there the ability of it really changing us cognitively? Well, cognitively may be a stretch in terms of what I'm trying to say, but, or the question I'm asking, but can we, is it harmless from the standpoint of I still have my idea, but this happened, like the shuttle example, not harmless, but, or do we fall into, well, I'll just believe this. I'll just go along with it, and eventually we actually change fundamentally.
I am optimistic that there are so many outlets today. There's so many ways to get information that people have access to it. Now, do they choose to use it or not? But certainly we have access to more information, more opinion, more analysis than we've ever had at any point. And so we're not being put into a situation where we're limited by information, as might happen in some authoritarian countries or other places where you actually are being limited and censored and punished and all that by the government. Right. In this case, what we're really talking about is a societal thing. Government still is, the First Amendment still exists. Yeah. There is still, Congress shall make no law. So this is really just societal pressure and how that changes. It's not, like a lot of things, it's not just new to this period. No. If you were opposed to the revolution at some point in colonial America, your press was destroyed. You were tarred and feathered. You were, so this is it's got historical. The difference is in degree now. The difference is in how things are done. So on the good side, there 1,000 opportunities to speak up, to speak out, to get information, to learn new things, to be exposed to different things. It's all up to us as individuals. And I've argued for a long time that Milton's belief that let truth and falsehood grapple and truth will come out the winner is dependent on a society that's both informed and interested in learning the truth. The question is, if we get to the point where we're not all that interested in being informed, and if we're not informed, and if we're not interested in that, then that's our own doom. Yeah. But we certainly have the opportunity now to do things we've never been able to do before. Yeah. The other thing is that, me as an optimist, is that we tend to overestimate the influence of media and social media, and again, we do have research on this with television and other things. We tend to believe that we are immune to that, us as individuals. Mm-hmm. Everybody else can be influenced in right. these ways, but not me, because I'm smarter, yeah. I'm more sophisticated. Yeah. Well, as I've said before, it's the Garrison Keillor thing of all the children are above average. Right. Well, at some point, if they're all above average, then they're not, there is no average. If we all believe that everybody else is susceptible to all this, and the honest truth is there are people who are very susceptible to sure. misinformation and other things. But the reality is that we also believe that we're not. Yeah. The studies show. So it can't both be true. We can't be both wildly manipulated by media and social media and then at the same time be able to withstand it. So my optimism is that in a lot of cases what's happening is that people are actually, they're not moving from here to here, they're moving from there to here. The bigger danger is what you talked about earlier, is that when then we start not even listening to people over here, or we start shutting down any alternative views. Right. And then does what is wrong again in quotes, have more trouble to become right later because we're not open to those viewpoints. Yeah. Or we're not seeking them out. We're putting ourselves in this situation where our media usage, our social media usage, is only things that reinforce our beliefs, and in fact maybe pull us even stronger in that direction. Yeah. But we're not really seeing people switch sides completely based on that. There's not a lot of evidence of that. And again, one of my examples is we don't change sports teams because of bad media coverage or a bad game. Yeah. So we don't have people who are
or bad seasons or bad decades.
or centuries with the Chicago Cubs for a while. But people didn't change because there was some negative coverage of the Cubs. They didn't say, I'm a White Sox fan. Yeah. We don't change. Most people don't change their religions very easily. So even if we see what the media coverage of what was occurring with the Catholic Church and the Boston Globe and Spotlight and all of that, we didn't have a whole lot of Catholics then become, evangelical Baptist, as a result of that. I mean, we didn't see millions of people switch their beliefs. They may have changed some viewpoints within that, but they didn't move from here to there. They didn't move from there to, they didn't become Muslim because of that coverage. Their beliefs were largely the same. Yeah. They just might have changed within that small area.
Yeah, and the idea that we don't know everything that there is to know. I mean, we're not omnipotent from the standpoint of just have access to everything. The openness to, there might be an idea or perspective that does, as you say, not switch all the way over, not like, flip, but at least open to the idea that maybe there's something else that needs to be considered here, that there's no absolute truth in terms of my perspective versus your perspective, but that in some ways us just being able to talk and to come to understand better this spiral of silence, mm-hmm. and that discourse. And I think that's really a word that's been thrown around quite a bit, especially in the last year or so, this idea that, hey, we need to have, civil discourse. In light of all of this that we've talked about, what ideas do you have about civil discourse and how we might be able to, keeping in mind the spiral of silence and the optimism with social media and the interactions, what I don't know, advice, what do you see that we could do as individuals? Because that's what it boils down to, I think.
Right. Well, so let's go back quickly to this idea of one way to stop groupthink is to encourage alternative views. And so one way to do it is to have somebody, who's a typical devil's advocate, who looks at things differently and starts to discuss it. When I was an editor, one of the things, anytime we had a big project, anytime we had a big series, when we were doing investigative pieces, what I learned to do over time was to either I did it myself or I had someone who would look at that from a completely different perspective and try to look at any place that there were any weaknesses in our coverage and our reporting. Were there any things that we were drawing conclusions on that we shouldn't? So to actually, have a designated thought process that we're going to challenge this and we're going to have a different viewpoint. So within companies, it's easy to do, or it's easier that you can actually say,
Part
okay,
of the process is
that we're going to challenge this, and let's spend the next little bit. What's wrong with this? Yeah. What assumptions are we making that might be flawed? And then you can do that process. The problem is, from an individual standpoint, is that we're not really built for that. We don't go into the Thanksgiving dinner conversation and says, okay, who's got a different opinion? Let's hear it. Yeah. We're not really open to that. And we tend to be a get along type of group of people, and so I think one of the things is that individually, if we could all just sort of embrace this idea of, okay, I think I know what this is about. I think I have a good opinion about it, but I'm going to explore it more. I'm going to look at the criticism of this. One of the things they talk about is that, one of the ways to strengthen your faith is to actually look at ways that it can be challenged and to think through, different viewpoints. And then your faith becomes stronger. It doesn't become weaker as a result. And if it does, maybe it wasn't what you thought it was to begin with. But this idea that we as individuals, the individuals that Milton believed in, that we would separate truth from falsehood, that we have a responsibility in a representative democratic society to be informed, to look at alternatives and to do that. Now, again, that may be a naive view. It may be a way overly optimistic view, but I think that's one of the ways out of it, is that we have to determine that we're not the expert on everything and that we're open to viewpoints that are different and that we can change our minds. And if we do, then that helps us become stronger in our beliefs.
So that responsibility, because we are in a democracy, there's an individual responsibility. That's part of the whole freedom to vote, to cast a vote, to be able to have that. But I also hear what you're also suggesting is an honesty as we move towards what our ideas are, like an honesty about, even if it is, as you say, here's my bias, but knowing also that there's however many billions of other viewpoints in the world, but so an honesty towards, I don't know everything, and what are some of the things that are out there. It may not change my opinion or at least my ideas, but there's an honesty about saying, well, let me actually approach it. And maybe that's overly optimistic too, that we want to put that much energy into, looking at things and making those sorts of decisions. Anything else before the AI question?
Well, I think the only thing is, that, again, do we want to invest the time and all that? So when we go back to this all versus entertainment, as we start to use social media and other media forms for so many different entertainment purposes, are we looking at candidates and their viewpoints? And are we looking at being a better informed voter? Are we looking at being better informed about it? I always loved it as a journalist when I learned information that changed a story.
Yeah.
And at the younger I was, the less that I was excited about that, because now I had to change. And in some ways, it was like, oh no, this. Right. And later, as I realized it didn't take me long to think, wait a minute, this is great, because now I'm better informed. I'm better informed and can better inform the readers, because I now know I have different context and perspective and facts and other things. Again, that may be the optimistic part. Are people wanting to spend that time to become educated in those areas, or do they want to just tell you that if somebody sticks their toe across the finish line, that should be the winner? I don't care what the Olympic rules are.
Yeah, and there's something as you were speaking, that this the trade-off between how we spend our time, because we spend a lot of time with devices, and that we can continue in this echo chamber, we can feel this spiral of silence, and we could let's just entertain ourselves. Let's just be entertained. Mm-hmm. Let's just pass the time, really, as opposed to, and again, we may be optimistic, and I think we might, I don't want to necessarily speak for you, but the idea that, well, part of our responsibility is to actually be serious about finding out the information and making an informed decision. And I think that's all I could ask from anybody, is that you've actually spent some time to try to figure out where you stand and why. My students hate it when I ask them why. Like everybody, they'll have I have an opinion and this is it. Well, why? And that's where sometimes we get in our best discussions, is finding out why we have an opinion. Mm-hmm. So what about artificial intelligence? How do you think that comes into play with this spiral of silence?
And I think, again, that's what Twitter's looking at right now, is as we are, as we're being sort of, as our communication channels are changing, as they're being influenced by different elements. Again, it is so hard to predict where all of this is going to go. Yeah. And so we not only don't know where it's going to go, we don't have the ability to then, most of us, to anticipate the harm and the gain that will occur as we go forward with it. It's also new. Yeah. I mean, it's all, and how does it change? I mean, again, if we go back 15 years ago, we have no idea about social media having this level of influence in society. Yeah. 15 years. And that's, it seems like a long time, but in world history and United States history, it's not very long at all. In media history, it's not very long. So I think, the issues, we don't even know all the problems. We don't know all the potentials. We don't know, so much of it is unknown, or those who know it are certainly a lot smarter than I am about it, right. And have a lot more to weigh in on it. But most of society has no idea where this is going to take us. Yeah. And what the implications are for communication or behavior or anything else.
Yeah, the ability for artificial intelligence, and going along sort of with what you're saying, this overwhelming amount of information that's out there, and the not content, let's say, right. Let's make it the idea that all this content is out there, and it's hard to know necessarily where it comes from, who's put it out there. And I know in particular with Twitter, the idea that there are a lot of false accounts, and that there's information that isn't true, or there's all these definitions now of information that and that artificial intelligence has a hand in developing that and creating that scenario, but also that it can have a hand in, I think this is where my understanding of what might happen at Twitter is that it also has a hand in helping deal with that,
right?
Helping uncover that, and so that's really, I think, what we can hope for with AI is that that it's not just malevolent and manipulative, that it also has and does, we know it does have some good for us, and is able to help us with some of the things that as we struggle along as humans and advance. Well, I want to thank you. Appreciate you coming here. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Make sure to subscribe and to hit the notification button so that you can be made aware of when we put up new episodes.